Hello everyone, and welcome to this feature video on the power charts that we're continuing. My name is Theodore Naiker from Speaker Astrology, bringing astrology to life. And today we're going to look at the chart of J.K. Rowling. Now, there isn't a confirmed birth time for Joanne, but there is sort of a time range. There was a sort of mention that she may be Aquarius Rising, from her own words in some interview somewhere. So given that range, I've sort of arrived at a time that I think, well, one of two times that I think sort of fits some of the key foundational life events from her childhood and early years in high school and things like that growing up, as far as we know. So we're going to look at that time and that chart, both in Western astrology, but also in Vedic astrology at the same time. So I just want to sort of give that sort of perspective on it, and sort of understand kind of the perhaps why the chart seems to be representing a lot of potential, even though she did have a difficult upbringing and circumstances around the time that Harry Potter as a novel kind of took place. So let's start off with the Western astrology, which I suppose is pretty relevant. So the time I've got that I'm using is 8:57 p.m. on the 31st of July 1965. And okay, I mean, in general, what I've noticed with people that are born on a Saturday is that there's something important to contribute to society as part of their life sort of journey. And, themes about hardship and, poverty and not having enough and overcoming that theme of lack in life seems to be quite important for these people. Now, in her chart, what I want to mention is I'm just using whole signs here, where each whole sign is a house. For the sake of the recording, I've also got the chart up in normal Placidus, so I will be moving between the two depending on what I feel like, and just to show you that it doesn't actually matter, it just depends on how you're reading it, okay? And both of them have value. So with this time of 8:57 p.m. Now, I must say that looking at her descriptions of childhood and her descriptions of high school and the descriptions of biographical accounts of, dressing pretty gothic in some instances and being quite shy and things like that, didn't really have a open childhood to begin with. That sort of made me kind of go with, well, it needs to be a night chart, because then, according to the techniques of Herdaria, a Persian-based timing technique, then it is the high school years are represented by Saturn, which should be indicative in this case of her being a bit grungy and things like that in high school, but also working very hard and being quite a private person, but having Saturn in Pisces trining Neptune in Scorpio, so those themes, I think Pisces scorpionic themes played a very big role in her adolescence, and which clearly obviously come out through the books in those themes of the Piscean themes of sacrifice and death and social relevance that come through. So that's one thing. The other thing is Aquarius Rising does kind of make sense. There was one scenario where I considered Scorpio Rising, but it didn't really, hold up. Perhaps if you're looking at a noon chart, then Scorpio Rising would be the case, and I felt that made things a bit too easy. It fits a public profile, but it doesn't quite fit in terms of the timings for upbringing and moving house and grandmother dying and mother dying and things like that. So this is just the time I've arrived at. One of the things I would say is that the midheaven here being at 7 degrees of Sagittarius, and about 3 or 4 degrees away from the south node, the nodal axis. They moved house when she was, I think, 3 or 4 years old, and then again when she was 9 years old they moved house a final time. And if you add 9 years to the 9 degrees to the midheaven, you get to about 16 degrees, which then brings the midheaven squaring Saturn in Pisces in the second house. And she did Saturn ruling the 12th house as well. That move also coincided with the death of her grandmother, which she says was a very important figure for her in her life. And indeed, her grandmother's name, Kathleen, is a name that she adopted later on in life when she had to, when her publishers asked her to come up with a second name for her writing career. So that is where the K from J.K. Rowling comes from, is from this grandmother that passed away. So I thought that was very important, and I felt it fit because Saturn ruling both the 12th house and the first house, which is our identity and also sadness in some way, and then by solar arc squaring the midheaven at the time of that move at 9 years old, both described the sort of sorrow that came into her life at that point, losing a Saturn Pisces archetypal figure in her life, who was obviously very caring, and an important role for her, being trining the Neptune. But also, it also became part of her identity, the name of this person. Saturn also rules the first house of the ascendant and the identity in the world kind of thing. So I thought that also fit quite nicely. You also have here, you'll notice that let's go into a little bit more of the chart here from a Western astrology perspective. So you can see that the sun, so the chart needs to be a night chart for all these various reasons, because her adolescence was very Saturnine in that way. So there we go. And also, being a night chart, the role of the father is for the most part seen from Saturn, and here we have Saturn below the horizon. We have Saturn in the sign of Pisces, retrograde, and also quite squarely opposed by Pluto. And the second house has to do with speech and voice and speaking, and her speech is fairly soft like that, but quite firm. But also Saturn representing the father figure for a night chart, according to the rules, being opposed by Pluto definitely does show the sort of difficult relationship she has with her father, that is ongoing, and she basically stopped speaking to her father a long time ago, and that is still the case today. So I think that also matches up. Having the moon in the 8th house also made sense, showing the archetypal mother figure in the 8th house, and the passing away of her mother was a huge thing for her, and she experienced a lot of that trauma through that, which then funneled and found its way into the books as the death of the mother figure and the sacrifice of love and the power of love in that bond between parent and child, which is so seminal to the Harry Potter story. So having the moon in the 8th house also made sense from that point of view. Okay. And what else do I want to say about the moon? She was also so let's just move on into the power figures of this chart. So normally you would think that the south node of the midheaven means that the person isn't really accomplishing anything or is difficult to sustain a job, and that's true. She doesn't really have a conventional 9-to-5 job. The ruler of the midheaven, which is Sagittarius here, the ruler of that, Jupiter, is also in detriment in Gemini, being opposite the sign that it rules. That also shows profession and sort of work that is against the grain, that is not in the system. And it is literary in a sense, or involved in the media, because Jupiter is in Gemini. So that shows quite clearly that the impetus for work is something literary in a sense, in that way. And it's Jupiter, which means it's quite big. It's not just some office kind of job. And yes, she did try and do some work in those fields with I think some activism groups and things like that. So she was kind of going in the opposite direction, anti-establishment sort of thing, before settling on, at least discovering the role of writing in that way, the authorship. The other thing I wanted to point out was that the ruler of the third house would obviously be important for a writer, and this being Aries, and the ruler being Mars, again in detriment in Libra, opposite the sign it rules, again shows that anti-establishment, maybe anti-religion sort of tack that seems to be there, and playing on the themes of religion and belief systems in that way. But also the third house representing siblings, her younger sibling, Diane, I think, is a lawyer. So that also matches with a Mars archetype in the sign of Libra, which is concerned about justice and exchange between people in that way. So fighting in the law system in the ninth house makes sense for a sibling in that way. And they used to play games where they would, when they finally settled on after their second move, she says that they had a big staircase for the first time, and so they would take turns dangling each other over the ledge of the staircase and pretending to kind of hold this power over each other, and then they would sort of fall to their death, sort of thing. And I thought that was interesting because the ruler of that Mars, which is the Venus, is in the 8th house of death and dying, and in Virgo, which is classically where we say Venus is in fall. So they were literally playing these games together as siblings, where they were playing with these themes of death already, literally falling from the cliff of the stairs, that sort of thing. And it's interesting that is one of the ways that Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, dies in the books, that he is basically he falls off from a tower. Yes, it was a wizard's kind of curse or spell that propelled him off it, but the theme of falling, and I noticed in the movies how that shot of Dumbledore kind of falling is so sort of iconic to that episode, and it carries a lot of, you can feel that emotion that is there behind that. So I thought that was also quite interesting that it is also reflected in the chart. Now, coming to the fame and the money story, obviously the sun is in Leo, and whenever the sun is in Leo, here it is below the horizon, but it is trining the midheaven. It has got a very strong trine to the midheaven degree, which shows that out of that sort of hardship, 6th house effect, let me just show you here, it is in the 6th. It is below the horizon, the sun. Having a trine to the midheaven does show that sort of success through hardship kind of story, but it's about meeting that person, that contact, that important contact that then sort of opens things up for you in that way. And whenever the sun is in Leo, I as an astrologer really care about what Mars is doing. So Mars in this chart again is in the 9th, it is ruling the 3rd sign, so that is all very strong. And in this, if you're using Placidus, the Mars rules the 2nd house and is in the 8th house. So that she's had a lot of expenses and things like that as well, due to Mars in her life. But we're not going to go into that. We're just going to talk about the archetype of the power here. So let me just go back to the whole signs chart. So that's very strong. The Mars is basically what is very strong as an archetype for her career-wise. Besides representing her sister, she was also moving very strongly towards anti-establishment activism sort of roles, and she also went to teach in a foreign land and things like that, lived abroad in that sort of year. She went to Portugal and had a baby and got married and things like that. So you see that Venus-Mars effect happening through the 9th house. Venus also ruling the 4th house coming through, showing residence and things like that. That is all fine. That is all that has happened. But that had to be given up, and she came back. The Venus is in fall. It's not sustainable as an event. But out of that, she had a child. And that is sort of when things started to change. When the 5th house became activated in her life, which is, I would say, having a child, that Jupiter really becomes active in a very strong way. And I think over the Mars influence becomes active and dominant. And why that's important for her, because Jupiter rules the 11th house and the 2nd house, which are 2 houses about money. They're very important houses for making money and keeping money. And so Jupiter is showing that she's keeping money through 5th house, which is a creation, a creative activity. And yes, Jupiter is in Gemini, which obviously is about writing. Not writing something unconventional, or being, while you're doing that writing, being in an uncomfortable situation or less than ideal circumstances, which is what was happening at the time. As a single parent, she was writing in the evenings, whenever she could, on pieces of paper or tissue, whatever the story goes. That does show the detriment environmental factor that is affecting the Jupiter. But nevertheless, the Jupiter is very strong because it is 11th sign from the Sun. It is the 10th sign from the Moon. These are very strong placement for Jupiter in terms of gain, as well as income, as well as career impulse. From the luminaries, this Jupiter is placed very strongly, and also it's very well placed from the ascendant being in the 5th house. It's also very strongly connected to the part of fortune, which it also rules. So that is also very strong. The 3rd house ruler, the Mars, is placed 11 signs away from the part of fortune, also showing that this is something kind of writing is going to grow from this, continuing that attack. Now, she did have some problems getting published and things like that because the Jupiter is in detriment again. So there are those kind of themes coming through, but the second publisher that came through, Bloomsbury, accepted it, and the rest is kind of history, and that is kind of both at the same time. She had a very difficult Saturn return, the death of her mother. So in June 1990 is when she had the idea for Harry Potter on the train, being mobile. Again, you're seeing that influence of the 3rd house Mars, 3rd house being transport, and the idea coming to her there in that way. And at the time in June 1990, what we can see, maybe I can show you here, if we just look at the transits, let's just go for middle of June 1990, you can see that same Jupiter is trining both, the Jupiter is exalted, which is the professional indicator for her, now being activated that she has a child, is trining the Saturn, but also trining the Neptune. And at the same time, you've got Pluto going over the Neptune, which is also very strong. And what is happening by, I'm not sure what's happening by progressions, but let's have a look. By progressions, what's happening in June is that we have the Moon conjoining both the progressed Mercury, which is important for writing to be activated, but also you have that same Moon connected to both the 3rd house ruler, the Mars, very strongly, and also connected to the Neptune again. So something in the 10th sign and the 9th sign being activated, that's very strong, I would say, in terms of creativity, but also in terms of writing, besides the fact that it is moving to conjoin the progressed Mercury as well on top of that, which is the ruler of the Jupiter. So this is all very strong testimony to manifesting something very strongly. That's kind of what I would say. And you can see here the progressed midheaven would then be trining all of these planets in the 8th house. And that would be very good, especially since it's actually just trined the Mercury, which is in its own sign, and which again is ruling the 5th house. So all that is very strong testimony coming forward from that point of view. Now, if I just go back to here, you can see that she said that she was writing since the age of 6. Now, June 1990 is when she started doing Harry Potter, writing Harry Potter at least, or got the idea for it. And we don't know what date, but she did start writing it in the evening, again, which kind of prompts me to believe in a evening time birth. When you're starting something important, there's a time resonance with us in terms of that. I should also point out that the Mercury is also conjunct Regulus, which is in the heart of the Lion. It's the star in the heart of the Lion constellation, which shows a lot of prominence coming through, and she is handling it very well. She manages the limelight, she keeps her family life private, and things like that, her second marriage and stuff like that, is well managed in that way. She's dealing with publicity quite well. What else have I written down here? Yes. So because the Mercury is in Virgo, that makes the North Node very strong. And the nodal axis here, according to traditional astrology rules, the nodes are exalted in the signs of Gemini and Sagittarius, respectively. The North Node in Gemini and the South Node in Sagittarius. So that is also a very strong testimony, and it being trine the ascendant is also very strong as well as a life path, destiny point of view. But you can see that she doesn't have a conventional career. The midheaven is conjunct the South Node, but it is trine the Sun. The Jupiter is connected to the part of fortune. The Lord of the 3rd house is well placed from the part of fortune, is well placed from the ascendant, is well placed from the moon and the sun. The Jupiter is well placed again from all of these places as well that are important: the ascendant, the part of fortune, the moon and the sun. So this is very, very strong activation. And just to keep things simple, yes, she did the Harry Potter events were basically triggered in the Jupiter Sun period. But in the Jupiter period is when Harry Potter was created, the circumstances emerged where she had a child and all of that. And by the first publication was in June 1997. So just before she got into her Mars period, all of this, the Jupiter was basically producing all of that as a form and as an effect. The writing, the Jupiter and Gemini in the 5th house, very, very strong, together with the child, obviously, which is also a 5th house Jupiter signification, and dealing with the difficult circumstances around her Saturn return. So you see, most of the work was done in the Saturn sub-period, during her Saturn return or post-Saturn return. And yes, she was dealing with being a single mother, Jupiter moon period, and she was living with her sister, I think in Scotland, in Edinburgh, I think it was, and preparing to become a teacher. That is the whole point. So she was looking at this Mars period coming, the Mars in the 9th house, and she was saying, well, I want to get back into teaching, because she did go to Portugal, 9th house, to teach English as a foreign language, and came back. And that is, so she's looking at this big Mars period coming and wanting to go into teaching. And she says that I needed to finish this book before I start teaching formally, because I won't have any time. And so there was a lot of time pressure on herself to finish things, and she was managing the baby at the same time, as well as doing the writing and obviously preparing to start teaching formally. And then in 1996, the book was taken up by Bloomsbury, almost the month after her birthday, in 1996. And in June 1997, the first book was published in the UK. And then the following year, in September, the first book was published, was released in the USA. So the release of the books happened in the, the Mars sort of period. Now again, that Mars is very strong from a point of view of influence, because it is in the ninth. It is in the ninth of publishing as well. That's also a ninth house signification. And yes, the topic is anti-establishment. It's the themes of justice and relationship and exchange are very, very strong, in a school sort of system, boarding school. Is it a boarding school? Yeah, it's a boarding school. Hogwarts is a boarding school situation. So you're seeing that here very strongly with the Mars and the potential threat to life and Voldemort and all those themes, because eventually the Mars goes to the Venus in the 8th house. So essentially you will see that during her Saturn return, she basically faced all of these planets that are opposing Saturn by sign. So she became a mother. The death of her own mother was a very platonic experience. Then, she had the Uranus feeling. She moved away. She went to Portugal to teach. She got married. She had a child. She had a divorce, or separated from the first husband, came back, and then ended up with the Mercury, which rules the 5th house, both being the child, but also, again, being the writing, the creative writing that she had to do. And so her Saturn return, in a way, gave her all of these things, both being very, very angular from the moon and also angular from the part of fortune. This is a very strong Saturn. And I think, according to traditional rules, Saturn is also... Saturn's not in Aries, but Venus, Mercury, and the Moon are all in a sign, in a placement, and in a night chart, very, very strongly placed in the 8th house. So essentially, the manner that she's done, the attitude that she's done is she's done writing, Jupiter in Gemini, in contact with the Moon. So the writings are quite big, they've grown. It is a waxing moon here that we're talking about. So the connection of the moon with the Jupiter has expanded the writing, and through the Mars Fedaria period, which takes us to 2004, 2005, when she finally finished the books. In that whole Mars period is when she further, continued writing the remaining several books in the series, which basically sustained her income. And further it became movies and all of that. Mars rules the Neptune as well in the 10th, so they also became movies, and that was also very strong. So that's just what's happening from a Western astrology point of view, just very basically. Now, if I go to the Jyotish, the Vedic astrology, we have Capricorn rising, Saturn retrograde in Aquarius, which is obviously quite strong. And we have Moon and Mars in the 9th, and that does show difficult relationship with the father. Besides the Saturn being in the 9th from the Sun, the 9th from the Ascendant also has quite a hot combination here of Moon and Mars, which is very strong. And you can see in the so that is true, that she has stopped talking to her father from a very sort of young age. The Mars, coincidentally, it represents the mother here, being the 4th house ruler, and that is also placed in the 9th house. So the mother figure was basically like the father in her life, and a guiding light for her, basically, together with the moon. That's a very strong emotional contact with the mother. Moon conjunct the 4th house ruler. Here, the 4th house ruler in Vedic is the mother. So that is showing very, very strong connection to the mother. And the Mars is also the Amatya Karaka, which is a career indicator. So that's also obviously very strong. Now, when we go to the Navamsha, obviously, just in the birth chart, having Jupiter and the Moon in trines does sort of indicate someone potentially to be an author, a very big global effects kind of authorship. That's true. The influence of Rahu with Jupiter, Rahu ruling the 2nd house, showing that money potential is there with the writing and creativity, but some circumstances are different, so she's gone abroad, she's come back, she's had issues about wanted to be a teacher, but it's not really working out, and these kind of things come through in that way. The nodes are very strong here as well. Different kind of rulership, but that is very strong. This Jupiter is the 11th from the Sun and 9th from the Moon. Especially being 9th from the Moon is very, very strong in terms of a blessing. So that Jupiter is very strong in a sign ruled by the Moon and Taurus, and the Moon also having an aspect on the Jupiter. So that's very strong. The Mars implication here with the Moon does mean that, yes, she does have to go through that, the loss of the mother and things like that as part of it. The ruler of the 9th house being Mercury is in the 8th. So they show some difficult experiences, and through that experience of loss of the father and not speaking with the father, the Mercury goes in the ruler of the 9th being Mercury going in the 8th house, but also that also activating her writing ability, which is also the Mercury mechanically, writing. That's also very strong. The Sun is in the 7th, and that is also very strongly linked with the mother in her case, being the Matrakaraka. And so she's really communicating with the public on that level. There's a whole lot of children out there that consider her as their sort of surrogate mother or fictional fantasy mother, because she's given them this whole new world to sort of play with. And the Sun in Cancer being a very strong pull there in the public in that way, as a heroine for children sort of thing happening. If we go to the Navamsha, we can see that what is happening here, it's Taurus rising, which is further strengthening the Jupiter, the 5th house in the natal chart. And it's conjunct the Hora Lagna. Okay, I'm not going to talk about special ascendants, but the 10th house here is Aquarius. So that Rahu, who rules Aquarius in the system of Vedic astrology I've learnt, is really giving a lot of that global impact. Moon and Jupiter together is already quite strong for the writer, but having the Rahu so powerfully indicating in the Navamsha also destiny and wealth is also improving that. And the Rahu's state in the Navamsha increases dramatically because the Navamsha, it's in Gemini, where it is exalted, and it's conjunct Mercury, which is its exaltate, it's also the own sign of Mercury. So that's very strong in the 2nd house. Both Mercury and Rahu being in the 2nd house in the Navamsha also show that the difficult relationship with the father and lack of speaking with the father, specifically because Mercury and Rahu are both rulers of the 9th house in the birth chart, which is showing the father. So the lack of communication and distance from the father is also shown by Mercury and Rahu there, which are the same things that are also showing the magnificent amount of wealth that is coming through from a global sort of level, being in Gemini about writing and things like that. We're just seeing the same thing from a different point of view. Now in the Navamsha, the trines, the 5th house has Jupiter and the 9th house has the Moon. And again, so here we are saying that both in the birth chart and in the Navamsha chart, the trines of the chart have Jupiter and Moon, and especially in the Navamsha having Jupiter and Moon in trines is a very big sign of an author, on that level, having influence through writing in that way with the masses. The Jupiter is giving, especially Jupiter in a Mercury sign, is giving that sort of ability to write a lot and to write quite thoroughly and with some structure and vision. But the Moon being involved in trines to the ascendant and the Jupiter is also giving that amount of breadth, and people accepting it and it being kind of widespread across the world, because in Jyotish, Moon represents a businessman on a much bigger scale, like, across country, international, that sort of trade and business. And that obviously having impact on Jupiter shows that influence of the writing. Okay, so I'm not going to go to the D60 chart, but in the chart of career, the Dashamsha here, you can see that again you've got a Jupiter in the 9th house with Mercury, all right, in a sign of Venus, and you've got Aquarius rising, Rahu again exalted in the 5th house, showing some kind of Raja Yoga happening. That's very, very strong, with the Lagna Lord is in the 5th house exalted. Okay, The seventh house having sun shows in own sign. That is also very strong to say, well, this person is working for themselves. All right, they're not working for anybody else. And the moon being in the fourth house is also very strong. The moon has Digbala there. So especially in the Dashamsha, that's important. Directional strength in the Dashamsha is very important. And having the moon in the fourth house does show that she has full control of her time in terms of schedule for her own work and things like that. That is obviously also very, very strong in, as something that we all know. She's in control of her time. So in terms of the timing, let's have a look here. So, well, with that wonderful Rahu that was giving everything in this system of astrology, you can see all the books and actually the whole seminal writings and things began in the Rahu-Jupiter period. And no surprise, they are both together in the fifth house here. And they have very strong aspect to each other in the Navamsha, being in Jupiter in the fifth house in the Navamsha as well. In the Rahu-Jupiter period, everything sort of happened, all the writing came forth in that way, sort of downloaded, the nodes are being exalted here in that way. And basically 2005 is when she basically finished all the books, writing them, I think. So and of course that's a Jupiter period, so the money is just continuing, right? Okay, there's not a problem. Shodha Shotari Dasha, which is kind of applicable here as well, is also showing more specifically, and I think a little bit more accurately, that all of the Mercury, who's ruling the sign of Gemini and ruling the sign, that very strong second house in the Navamsha, and ruling the moon in the birth chart, that's sort of also very strong in the third house ruler being ruled by Mercury. More specifically is being shown from 1990 to 2007, and I think that's a little bit more accurate in terms of the timing, because she began in 1990 after her mother's death, especially at the end of 1990, where things really kicked off in terms of the seminal story there with Harry losing his mother early on in the books. And if you look at the Narayana Dasha, well, is it any surprise that, okay, so she started writing the books in the Pisces period. That sort of makes sense because it is the Arudha Lagna and it is ruled by Jupiter, which is in the third thereof. So writing specifically coming through. And Pisces is also the seventh from the moon, the seventh from the Lord of the third house. This is all very strong impetus, and it's also ninth from the sun. So I think that also kind of makes sense in terms of environment. But she was basically struggling to get a publisher, and then all of a sudden 1995 came along. She finally finished the books in 1995, which obviously here is Aquarius, and that makes sense because Aquarius is a very important sign here. It's the 10th house in the Navamsha. It's the second house having the Lagna Lord in the birth chart, with the ruler of that sign being conjunct to Jupiter, involved in the trines of the chart. That's very strong activation, together with the sign Cancer, which is activating the sun. 1996 is when actually, however, it was actually taken up by a publisher, and that's the Aquarius Gemini. Of course, that's very strong because in the Navamsha, that's linking the 10th house and the second house with both of its rulers, in own sign and exaltation. So that is clearly very, very strong from a destiny point of view, from a Navamsha perspective, happening. And then the rest is basically history. And that also ends up in 2004, after which the books were finished. So I think that basically is what I wanted to show you, how both the systems are kind of working together and kind of saying the same thing. The Vedic kind of gives a little more detail, I suppose, but I could have done the same thing, doing a little bit more transits and progressions and solar arcs with her chart in the Western astrology system. But the point is that you can see that they are both working very well together and basically effectively saying the same thing, although the Vedic is kind of showing a lot of power as well. I haven't talked about the special ascendants, but if you look at the charts, you'll see that the special ascendants are very, very strongly connected. Here, the Ghataka Lagna and the Hora Lagna, both the rulers of that have full Rashi Drishti on the ascendant. And the Ghataka Lagna and Hora Lagna are basically involved in the trines of the Navamsha. And Jupiter is Atmakaraka, so it's also from Swamsa in that way. So very, very strong power and wealth also given in that way for an author, which is very, very, was unconventional at the time. Okay, so hope you enjoyed this little video, feature video, the second installment of Power Charts. We talked about the chart of J.K. Rowling, well, at least the time that I've arrived at. The degree of the ascendant in the Vedic fits her name, so that also sort of makes sense to me. And we'll see you with the next installment. Okay, bye-bye.